Hi, so in our last video, we talked about how God blesses obedience. For the second video in our obedience series, I want to talk about our motivations to obey God. In 1 Samuel 15:22 through 23, it says, "And Samuel said, Has the Lord as great a delight in burnt offerings and sacrifice as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. For rebellion is the sin of divination, and presumption is as iniquity and adultery. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you from being king." So for a little context and backstory on this, Samuel had told Saul not to offer any sacrifices until he arrived on the seventh day. Saul got impatient because the time was almost up, and he was seeing that the people just abandon him and leave. And so he assumed in order to keep God's favor and ensure that they won the battle, he needed to sacrifice. And so he went ahead and did it, even though Samuel had told him to wait. However, in sacrificing, Saul actually doomed himself to have the kingdom taken away from him. So many times in our own lives, we can do what we think the Lord wants us to do simply to gain his favor or blessing, like with Saul. This isn't what God wants for us. God told Saul through Samuel that obedience is better than sacrifice. Sometimes God will tell us that we shouldn't be doing something, and so we look at it as, okay, we'll just sacrifice this for God. And so we look at it as some way that we can earn favor, or sometimes we'll flaunt it and be like, oh, look at what I'm doing. I'm sacrificing so much for God, and that's not obedience. That's kind of along the lines of what Saul did. Is he did things out of a self-serving motivation to try and gain something for himself. Just kind of using us as an example, and we'll do videos discussing this in a little bit more detail at a later point, but one thing God has called us to do is to remain pure in our relationship, to avoid things like sex and living together until we're married. And so we know that this is something that God's asked us to do, and we're trying to do it to honor him with our lives. If on the flip side we were doing it only because we wanted to get a blessing, we would have the wrong motivations. When we give something up like this for God and sacrifice our desires for him, we can sometimes get a mindset of, hey, look at me, look what I'm doing for God. And we assume we can earn his favor, when really grace, which means unmerited favor, is a free gift that we can't earn.
Well, it kind of goes into, when Jesus was calling out the Pharisees and what they were doing. And he said multiple times in the New Testament, don't look like the Pharisees. Don't stand on the street corner and say, look at what I'm doing. Or before they handed things out to the poor, they would make a big show of it. And so they were acting like, hey, look at what we did for these people. Because they were doing it because of self-gratification, right, self-motivation, versus doing it from their heart and doing it in the secret and not sharing it.
And something else I've got on the same lines that I was just thinking of, I don't remember exactly where it is in the Old Testament, but there is a point where through one of the prophets, they were basically saying, oh man, what a burden this is. It's such a burden to have to do your commandments. And it's really not if you're doing it with the right motivation. I mean, if you're doing it with a mindset of that you have to do it to try and please God, that you have to do it to earn his favor, then yeah, it's going to seem a lot like a burden, because it's not something you're just doing because you love him. Mm-hmm. And we do obey him because we love him and we know that he deserves our obedience, not because we can manipulate him into blessing us or because we're earning salvation or anything of that nature. He blesses us because he desires to bless us, not because we earn it. We have to be living in obedience to see many of his blessings, but the motives of our heart do matter. To use another example, just to stick with the marriage theme, say if an earthly husband, or say if a husband decides to give his wife a back rub, and every time he gives a back rub, he expects something in return. All's well when he gets what he's hoping for, but if he frequently does not, that can cause a lot of bitterness and resentment. But on the flip side, if he goes in with no motives other than just to show his spouse love and affection, if anything else happens, it's a bonus and not a requirement. And the same is true of our relationship with God. If we go into obedience with an expectation that he will always bless us, we have an unhealthy expectation. And this can cause a root of bitterness within us. But if we serve God because we love him, any blessings he does provide to us are just an added bonus. To be honest, we're not always going to see blessings, or they may not be the blessings that we expect. But we will be blessed by God, be it in a growth in our relationship with him, financial and material provision, spiritual gifts. God blesses his people with many different types of blessings.
Well, and also with that, you have to be seeking those blessings, because sometimes something that occurs, it won't be the way we thought it was going to come across. And when we're, in obedience, just looking at all the small things that God does do while you're being obedient. Because it could just be like, you needed something for a vehicle and the part came in earlier than it was, so you didn't have to wait as long. So there's some things like that, but I do believe there's some of our blessings that we will never receive until we get to heaven too.
Right.
He even says, store up your treasures in heaven, not here on earth. But I think if we're not looking for the blessings, or we're looking for only big things to happen, those small things will just fall through the cracks. And I know some of the blessings that I've seen, coming out of, walking through grief with my children. I've seen blessings that my kids have honestly started turning back to God. And they know, mom's handling grief her own way, things are happening. So, all I do is like send them devotionals or send them a verse to send them right back to God. And my kids who weren't in the Bible as often as the other ones were are now opening their Bible every day and reading. And so I could just overlook that as, oh, well, good for them. But that's a huge blessing. It's a huge blessing to see your kids walk in faith with God through the hardest time that they've ever had in their life right now, and losing a father. So I think that's those are just small blessings that we sometimes will just take for granted, that when God's doing certain things in our life, sometimes he'll show you little things like that just so it would encourage you to obey and to stay on the right path, that you are doing the right thing.
Well, and one thing that you kind of touched on a little bit is you have to be looking for the blessings. And the thing on it is like, I think today there's so many people that are so scared of talking about blessings. And so when you talk about blessings, it becomes like you're a prosperity preacher or whatever. So they kind of go the extreme opposite side, where they're like, oh, God doesn't bless anybody. And the big problem with that is God does bless you. And so you're getting these blessings from God, but you're not recognizing them as blessings from God. And so then you're basically taking these blessings that God's giving you, and you're not giving him the proper praise and glory for it. And so you're basically just saying, oh, I did this. This was my doing. So that's something we kind of have to be careful of too, is we can very easily, if we don't recognize that God is blessing us, we can start to think that those blessings that we've received are of our own doing, and they're not. Mm-hmm. But whether we get blessings or not, whether we receive blessings or recognize them, the key in our relationship with God is to always be content with whatever we've got from God, and to trust that he will provide for us. I think we could probably all agree that Paul was a pretty obedient person, and so Paul talks about that he's had high times and low times. So we're not always going to be going through these big blessings, and it doesn't mean that we're not being obedient to God because we're not being blessed. For everything there's a season. Mm-hmm. But in Philippians 4:11 through 13, Paul says, not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things through him who strengthens me. And so, like Paul was talking about there, we will have seasons of plenty and seasons of hunger. But in every season, the key is to willingly serve God and be grateful and content for the provisions he gives us, knowing that whatever he gives will be more than enough to meet our current needs. And that may not be the needs that we think we need, but the needs that he knows we need in that situation according to his will.
Yeah, because he's never going to let his children go hungry or anything like that. He will provide. And it's just, are we looking for the way that we're supposed to provide? Because we have to put our feet down and we have to move. We can't just sit. Some things like that happen. You can pray about it and then someone shows up, but you have to be, the willing part of your heart has to be willing and open to accept what God's getting ready to do. So.
Yeah, and you just have to be dependent on him. I mean, Jesus says that you have to be like one of these, like a child, to enter into the kingdom of heaven. And that doesn't mean to be immature. It doesn't mean to act childish. I mean, when I think of a child, like especially like a little child, what I think is when they need something, they reach up with their hands and call to their parents. And that's how we need to be, is we need to recognize our needs and bring those before the Father, trusting and believing that he will be able to provide those needs. And maybe not in necessarily the way that we assume, but he will provide for us. So we just have to keep trusting him in everything.
Yeah, because I mean, when you fully rely on what he has for you, when you abide into the word, like we were talking in the first video, abiding means literally putting your full faith into him and allowing him to work. Just part of it. I mean, we watched a house go from a thought to a, hey, we bought it. And it's been just crazy, just kind of the whole thing that went through and how God just, but if I wasn't in the word and I wasn't praying, walking into that house, I wouldn't have known. I could have said, it's too small, it's just not going to work for us. And God would have been like, that's the house I have for you. But it was, both of us praying, knowing that I, was longing to have my own place and wanting someplace and knowing that this would be the town that was going to be the cheapest for me and that I could have a house and we could add on to it. I mean, there's just a lot of things. And so it does both praying and us both being in there, and pushing each other to be obedient. And well, God said, hey, move, do this. We both were like, okay, he says, move, do this. And so and honestly, buying a house is not something you take lightly, but God was like, nope, you're going to have to jump and go.
Right. And
so that was huge. Like, I had to take a whole step, not even a step. Like, I felt like I had to like jump off a cliff almost and be like, okay, I'm buying this house. And it was crazy, but God like sustained the whole process and still sustaining the whole process. And that'll be another video series that we'll probably go through how the house all came about. And I mean, right now it's looking like it'll be completely debt free. So we won't have a house payment. We'll own the house right out. And so that was a huge prayer of mine. Has been a prayer, and crazy thing is, it's a prayer that I've had for over 20 years, that if I ever purchased a home, I wanted to make sure I was not house poor. And so as I've watched the obedience of God digging into my heart and cleaning things out that need to be cleaned, I'm now seeing, the fruit of that. So.
And just kind of to touch on that a little bit, I mean, like you said, we'll talk about it more in detail on how that all came about in a later video, but I mean, that's a good example of like fully relying on God, because that day she was just really stressed out and was like, I'm done. I'm gonna go rent a place. I'm sick of trying. She'd been looking for a house for a while, and everything was like in the $200,000 range. It was way expensive, and really, even in that price, like it wasn't as big as she needed for everything.
When you have 7 kids, you have to have a large house. Like you can cram them into small houses, but we wanted something decent size.
But she was like, I'm just gonna go rent, and I knew that if she did that, she was just basically gonna be wasting money. And so I went to God and I was like, God, this can't happen. We've got to have a house. We got to find something that we can purchase and get her moved into it. And so I was praying for it. And for whatever reason, I took a different path home that day. And I drive by this house and I take a picture of it. And then I send it to her, and then I get home and look and see how big it is. And I'm like, oh, that's too small. No. But she's like, God's already working on her heart, saying this is the one. And she's got this whole plan that. And so here we are, like we're in this situation now, but we have to just kind of be willing to see when God's hand is moving. I mean, and it was clear and evident that
Yes.
God was moving, because like then we found out who owned the house. They're here in town. she knows them.
Yeah, I
We
know.
walk towards their house and they just happen to be pulling in the moment that we get there.
Yeah.
And then we go look at this house. And so there were so many things. God doesn't work in coincidences.
No.
There were
There's
so
nothing
many things that
yeah.
it couldn't have been coincidences. And so we knew God's hand was in it. But we
But I
have to be
mean-
looking for those things and
Yeah.
recognize
But
them.
then a lot of the things, like, I guess, you know, just to talk about like the obedience part, is that Dylan and I have been separately, God's been working on our hearts. And there are things that, you know, we'll probably do videos of, you know, the things that God has like really pulled apart in our hearts. But there's things not just only of our relationships that we've had to work together, but God has called us to work on some really hard things, like, you know, forgiving people that we don't want to forgive. And there's, you know, just battles that we've had, and God's like, hey, we're going to have to work on this. So are you going to be obedient and let me take care of those? And so we had a lot of, they weren't small. I'm not going to say they were small. They were huge things in our lives that we've had to hand over to God, and we've had to just be obedient to let God work in our hearts. And I think that's part of, you know, our motivation to do this is motivation should be that you want your heart clean. So when God comes in, that heart is, you're allowing him to clean out those bad spots in your heart so he can give you a new heart and you can love differently. I think there's a lot of things that got cleaned out of my heart that now I feel like I can love not only Dylan better, but I can love my children better. The bitterness, a lot of the bitterness is gone. Working on gossip, stuff like that. God's like, you know, this has got to be sliced off because I'm calling you into ministry. And these are some bad habits you have. And in ministry, it could really ruin you. So when you're looking at those things, and he's called us to do ministries, you know, like, you know, writing letters to people or meeting with just ladies one-on-one and talking to them. There's still more to come. We know there's a lot more ministry, but we know that God's still chipping away some of those things in our hearts. So if we weren't obedient to letting God come into those soft spots of our hearts and to clean them up and get them out, we wouldn't be where we're at. We've had to be obedient in those hard, really tough things that God's called to clean out and just do a spring cleaning, honestly. Come in and spring clean our hearts so that we have this whole thing of obedience and learning to obey even in the hardest things that you don't want God, or you don't really want anybody to know that's been in your heart.
And it's kind of like, it can't be just partial. You got to fully give it over to him. It's like, you kind of have to imagine your house like, or your heart like a house. If you invite Jesus into the house, you can't just be like, okay, you know, I'll let you clean the kitchen, the dining room, the bedroom, but the attic, the basement, and that extra bedroom over there, like, those are off limits. Stay out of those. I'm keeping those for myself. We have to basically say, Jesus, clean it all. Take it all. If there's something in there that you don't want, take it all. So it just has to be a complete surrender.
Yeah.
And that's where motivations really come in. Because if you're not motivated to do it for the right reasons, you're just going to give just a partial surrender, and you're just going to just basically, this is how much I'll give you, but the rest I'm going to keep for myself.
And I think this is something huge because this is something I've learned a lot more just, you know, growing when God has put my life on hold. Is that God came in and was like, you don't understand what obedience is, and you're not understanding what I need to do in your heart. Because we do, I feel like there's like kind of a disservice in the church that we don't disciple people to understand that these are things that you have to go through so you can have a deeper understanding of God. We understand a surface level of God, but when we allow God into our hearts and to really start cleaning it out, the Bible becomes, I don't know how many times I've told Dylan, I said, dude, like, I see different colors now. Like, I see the world in a total different way by reading my Bible and letting God come in and work on those things. It has just been totally different.
And it's been awesome watching you grow. Like, you have, over the last couple months, you have grown so much. Like, and to see you be so open to, like, something that maybe you've always believed one way, like, be open to hear explanations of why to believe another way, and allow people to back it up with scripture and go in with an open mind. And there's not a lot of Christians that'll do that, and
a lot of things this has been one of them, is blessings. Because I remember us having that conversation, and I was like, yeah, I heard about, you know, God blessing people, but I've seen certain small things, but I've never seen like where it comes into place, but then talking about how we have to be obedient. And then you can see where God works.
Yeah, and
So,
I mean, obviously, since then, we have no doubt that God blesses people because we just keep seeing. Well, every time we are faithful in an area, we see God just keep giving blessings back, and it's been unreal the last couple months. It really has.
there'll probably be a book about it soon.
Probably.
We'll have to have one of those.
So, but anything else you think?
I don't think so. I think we're good.
Well, we've got one more video in this series. Probably won't be today, but be on the lookout for that, and have a great night.